The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the studio shifted. Byron Donalds, calm, collected, said what many thought no one would dare to say on live television. Black families were stronger during Jim Crow, and across from him sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, still, silent, listening like a storm waiting behind glass. What happened next wasn't a debate. It wasn't even a takedown. It was something far more rare, a reckoning. In 60 electrifying seconds, AOC didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. What began as a political panel turned into a national mirror, one that forced every viewer to ask, what kind of history are we willing to excuse to feel comfortable today? This story is a dramatization, but the emotions it captures are real. The truths it reflects come from lived pain, generational memory, and the sharp edge of courage. Because sometimes the only way to tell a deeper truth, one, is to let fiction speak the words history taught us to whisper. The Bronx skyline outside her window was bleeding into darkness, its sharp edges softened by the amber glow of old streetlights. Inside, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat alone in her congressional district office, a mug of untouched chamomile growing cold beside a stack of handwritten notes. The walls were quiet, but the air wasn't still. It never was when something felt wrong. The only sound in the room was the soft, mechanical hum of her laptop. On screen, a viral clip looped again. Byron Donalds stood under the bright lights of a conservative policy summit in Tampa, hands folded neatly in front of him like a preacher mid-sermon. The crowd behind him was largely white, well-dressed, nodding along in polite reverence. Back during the Jim Crow era, he said, voice calm, eyes steady, Black families had more structure. We had discipline. We had values. Communities were tighter. Homes were stronger. The room had erupted in applause. Alexandria didn't flinch. She didn't blink. But something in her shifted. She hit pause. The screen froze on Donald's mid-gesture, smiling. More structure, she repeated silently. Under Jim Crow. Her fingers curled slowly into fists, knuckles whitening. Her jaw clenched, but her face remained unreadable, composed, calculating. Years in politics had taught her how to hold the storm behind her teeth until it was time to let it rain. And then, like a whisper too bitter to swallow, the thought escaped. Is he polishing chains and calling them bracelets? Outside, a horn blared. In the distance, the rumble of an uptown train. She leaned back in her chair, gaze fixed not just on the screen, but on everything behind it. The history he'd just rewritten, the pain he'd just powdered into policy points. Her grandfather had been denied a loan 4 times despite spotless credit. Her cousin had been followed through department stores for wearing a hoodie. Her neighbors had buried sons, not because they lacked structure, but because the system didn't recognize their humanity. She whispered it to the room. How dare he? Suddenly, the door burst open with the kind of energy that only shows up when something urgent and potentially explosive is about to happen. Alay! It was Eva, her chief of staff. No knock, no small talk. Just a phone in one hand and a flash of worry in the other. Crossfire America, she said. They want you. Tomorrow night, national segment, you and Byron. Face to face, Alexandria didn't move, didn't breathe. She could feel her pulse in her temples. The producers weren't stupid. They knew exactly what they were doing. Put the firebrand progressive Latina from the Bronx across from the rising Black conservative from Florida. Add cameras, shake, serve hot. They weren't just booking a segment. They were lighting a fuse. Topic? AOC asked quietly, already knowing. Eva swallowed. Race, responsibility, and that quote. The room felt heavier. Her phone buzzed with texts she didn't read. She could already imagine the headlines. AOC versus Donalds. Clash of cultures. The thumbnails. The sound bites. The traps. But she also saw something else. The face of a high school student who had once told her, "My uncle says Jim Crow wasn't that bad. He said at least families stuck together." It wasn't just about Byron. It was about what his words allowed others to believe, and what that belief could justify. She turned slowly back to her screen, watched the frozen image of Donalds again. This time, She didn't just see a political opponent. She saw a mirror, one reflecting a version of America that insisted the worst parts of its past were somehow its glory days. Alexandria stood. Eva, still waiting for a response, raised an eyebrow. AOC took a breath, rolled her neck, and reached for her blazer, the deep blue one with the soft inner lining she always wore when things were about to get messy. "Do they want polite?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Eva gave a nervous laugh. "They want a moment." Alexandria slid her phone into her bag. Her voice was calm but carried the low rumble of something about to catch fire. "Tell them," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'll bring the facts." She walked toward the door, paused, looked back once more at the still image of Donald's. And the fire. Ava nodded and ducked out to make the call. Behind them, the Bronx lights blinked steadily in the dark, unconcerned, unchanging. But in that small office, something irreversible had begun to stir. Tomorrow, the world would be watching, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would be ready to burn down the lie. The DC studio buzzed with quiet urgency, an energy that pulsed just beneath the surface like the air before a summer storm. Fluorescent lights hummed from above, casting a sterile glow over the sleek glass desk and the matte black stage floor that seemed to swallow footsteps. Staffers moved with clipped precision, their whispers blending with the hiss of pressurized mic checks and the occasional snap of a clipboard closing. The countdown clock in the corner blinked red. 23:44 until live. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped into the hallway behind the set, her heels clicking softly against polished concrete. She wore a tailored slate gray suit, clean lines and no jewelry, no distractions. Her hair was pulled back in a low twist, not out of vanity, but focus. Her team had offered 3 different options for wardrobe. She picked the one that said, "I came to testify, not entertain." As she passed the final curtain separating her from the stage, she caught a glimpse of him. Byron Donald sat already in his chair under the glow of the overhead lights. Posture relaxed, hands folded neatly on the desk, chin tilted ever so slightly as if the set were his living room and America had just pulled up a seat. He wasn't smiling exactly, but his expression was close. A studied calm, practiced ease. The kind of calm that said, "I've done this before, and I'm not worried." A tech brushed past AOC with a coil of black cable slung over his shoulder. Another crew member held up 2 fingers behind a camera rig. A young black woman in a production headset moved into her path with a clipboard, stopped, looked up, and froze for a moment. Their eyes met. She couldn't have been older than 25. Her locks were tied back, headset slightly askew, lanyard tag reading T. Owens, production assistant. Without a word, the young woman mouthed something. "Get him." It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even partisan. It was permission. A silent benediction from someone who had seen too many sound bites framed without context, too many headlines that turned pain into punchlines. In that fleeting second, AOC felt the weight of a million quiet nods behind her. She gave a slight nod back. She stepped onto the set, boots firm on the mark taped to the floor. A producer gestured her toward the chair opposite Donald's. She took her seat, spine straight but not stiff. Her mic was clipped on by a man who smelled faintly of strong coffee and deadline sweat. Another technician ran a final sound check, her voice echoing slightly through the earpiece. She barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere now. As the final minutes ticked down, her thoughts didn't turn to polling data or talking points. They turned to her abuela. She remembered the stories, not told with bitterness, but with the calm ache of someone who had accepted that struggle was part of life. Stories about being denied an apartment because her skin was too dark for this neighborhood. About being stopped and frisked while carrying groceries home in East Harlem. About the night immigration officers raided a neighbor's apartment by mistake, and how the children didn't sleep right for weeks after. She remembered her abuela saying, "Mija, the rules were never written for us. They were written to keep us reading the same line over and over." And now here she was, sitting across from a man who dared to suggest that those rules had built something worth admiring. The countdown blinked. 00:42. She inhaled once, steady and deep, grounding herself. The moderator's voice crackled through the earpiece. "We're live in 30. Byron looked at her for the first time since she'd entered. He nodded once, polite, professional, unreadable. AOC met his gaze. No smile, no fear. Just quiet resolve. 30 seconds, the producer said. This is it. And as the final moments ticked away, Alexandria didn't think about winning. She thought about the truth, about who would hear it, and about what they might carry with them long after the broadcast ended. The red light above the camera flicked on. Showtime. The red light above the center camera blinked to life, and just like that, millions of viewers were ushered into a studio that had been humming with silent tension for nearly an hour. The moderator, a seasoned host with a voice smoothed by years of diplomacy and morning news, smiled into the lens. Good evening, and welcome to Crossfire America, where tonight we're joined by two members of Congress who have very different perspectives on race, history, and responsibility in modern America. From New York's 14th District, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and from Florida's 19th, Representative Byron Donalds. AOC offered a curt nod. Byron smiled. The host gave his standard framing, last week's viral speech, Donald's controversial remarks in Tampa, and the storm that had followed. Then he turned to his guests. Congressman Donalds, he said, you recently made a comment that sparked widespread reaction. Would you like to clarify what you meant when you said, and I quote, Black families had more structure during the Jim Crow era? Donalds leaned forward with the quiet confidence of a man who'd practiced this answer. Thank you. Yes. What I said, and I stand by it, is that despite the injustices of that time, and they were real, we saw stronger family units in the Black community. Back then, we didn't rely on government subsidies. We built, we endured. There was pride, discipline, and unity. Those are values I believe we've drifted away from. A nod here, a calm hand gesture there. On the surface, it sounded measured, even thoughtful, until you listened harder, until you felt the weight of what had been smoothed over. The moderator turned to AOC. Your response, Representative? She didn't rush. She looked directly at Donalds, then into the camera, her voice low and controlled, slicing through the air like a scalpel wrapped in silk. Congressman Donalds, she began, when you speak about Jim Crow as if it came with pearls of wisdom, do you realize who had to choke on that string? The studio fell silent. Even the hum of the lights seemed to pause. Donald's expression flickered, just for a second. Alexandria kept going, her tone unwavering. I grew up hearing stories of women evicted for being too brown, of men pulled from cars because they fit a description, of families told they could not buy homes because their skin meant their children would lower property values. You want to talk about structure? The only structure many of our families had was built to contain them, not support them. Donald shifted slightly. The smile faltered. He straightened his tie. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, he said, steady but firm, I'm not romanticizing segregation. I'm highlighting cultural strength. We had fathers in the home. We had faith-based communities. Back then, we weren't victims. We were builders. AOC tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, in disbelief. Builders? She repeated. Builders under what? A roof of fear? You're not defending values. You're distorting violence. The Black community didn't thrive because of Jim Crow. We survived despite it. That's not the same thing. There was no audience in the studio, but in living rooms across the country, viewers leaned in. Something was happening, something rare. Not just a disagreement, but a moral reckoning wrapped in live television. Donalds tried to recover. You can't ignore the data. Out-of-wedlock birth rates were lower, crime was lower, graduation rates were higher. AOC interrupted, calm but fierce. Data doesn't speak when the context is gagged. You want numbers? I'll give you names. Emmett Till, Fannie Lou Hamer, Baird Rustin, people whose families were structured enough to raise brilliance and still watched it be beaten, jailed, or silenced. Her voice was firm, not loud. There was no shouting, just precision, like watching someone carve a message into marble with a scalpel. And if we're going to start pretending Jim Crow was some blueprint for dignity, she added, then we've lost more than just historical memory. We've lost our conscience. For a second, the moderator didn't speak. Neither did Donald's. The silence held, not empty, but dense with meaning. The kind of silence that didn't ask for a reply, only for reflection. And in that silence, something shifted. The first strike had landed, not as a blow, but as a truth that couldn't be unspoken. Byron Donalds didn't waste time trying to defend the past any further. He shifted his tone, leaned slightly forward in his chair, and placed his hands flat on the desk like a man building a bridge to safer ground. His voice, calm and practiced, took on the cadence of a preacher assuring his congregation that all was not lost. "What I'm talking about," he began, "is self-reliance, responsibility, the values that held our communities together when the system wasn't designed for us. Before government handouts became a substitute for hard work. Before fatherhood became optional. Before our children started learning dependency instead of discipline." His words had rhythm, repetition, and the warm tone of concern. But Alexandria heard the pattern beneath them. This wasn't just a pivot. It was a redirection laced with subtle indictment, one that blamed the brokenness on the broken instead of the hand that had dropped them. She didn't blink. She waited, letting him fill the space with what sounded like reason. Then she struck. "Let's talk about those values," she said evenly. "Since the 1970s, incarceration rates in Black communities have quadrupled. Not because crime exploded, but because sentencing policies were designed that way. Entire neighborhoods were gutted by mandatory minimums and broken windows policing." Donalds opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't pause. "You want to talk about fathers missing from homes? Start with three-strike laws and drug enforcement that punished addiction instead of treating it. You want to talk about self-reliance? Let's talk about red-line zip codes where small business loans were denied for decades, where school funding depends on property taxes, and surprise, those properties were never allowed to accumulate value." She turned slightly toward the camera, not for show, but because she wanted those watching to feel that she was speaking directly to them. "This isn't a crisis of character. It's a consequence of policy." Donalds's smile thinned. He straightened his posture, drawing himself taller in his seat. "Look, I get it," he said, exhaling like he was explaining something to someone who wouldn't understand. "You've built your brand on tearing down every system that doesn't fit your worldview. But maybe it's easy to see the world as broken from your position. Ivy League degree, blue check, millions of followers. You're not exactly in the trenches anymore, Congresswoman." There it was, the jab wrapped in politeness, the accusation of distance, elitism. But AOC didn't flinch. Her lips curved slightly. Not a smile, but something close to recognition. "You think my voice is Harvard," she said slowly, "but it was raised in Queens, fed by struggle, sharpened by watching my dad die before I could pay off his hospital bills, forged by the sound of neighbors arguing with landlords who charged double rent and ignored leaks. My voice didn't come from lecture halls. It came from laundromats and overtime shifts." She let that settle. Not as a defense, but as a statement of identity, something that couldn't be undone by degrees or detractors. "And I didn't build my brand," she added. "I built trust with people who've been told their pain is a result of their own choices, when really it's a result of choices made about them." Donalds looked like he wanted to respond, but the studio air had shifted. The control room lights blinked. The crew stopped fidgeting. Even the moderator leaned back slightly, sensing that this wasn't just sparring, it was unraveling something deeper. Because in that moment, it wasn't about ideology, it was about credibility. And AOC wasn't arguing from theory, she was arguing from memory. The kind of memory that lives in rent receipts, funeral bills, and public bus transfers with fingerprints on them, from hands that never got the luxury of wiping clean. The air between them had grown heavier with each exchange. It was no longer just a conversation. It was a reckoning. Words had stopped being arguments and started becoming artifacts, dug from deep places neither of them could fully name aloud. But Alexandria wasn't done. Not yet. She watched Donalds as he adjusted his cuff, a tiny gesture betraying nerves he hadn't shown earlier. He wore composure like armor, and for the most part, it had held. But she'd seen the micro cracks, just enough to know he wasn't invincible. So she leaned in slightly, her voice softening. Not to be kind, but to go deeper. Congressman, she said almost gently, I want to ask you something, and I'm asking honestly. Are you speaking as someone shaped by the struggle, or someone softened by distance? The line landed with such quiet precision that for a second, even the blinking cameras seemed to freeze. Byron didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in calculation, as if trying to decide whether to respond or retreat. AOC didn't let him. Because from where I'm sitting, she continued, it sounds like you're not remembering history, you're romanticizing it, like you've lived just far enough away from the worst of it to mistake survival for design. And maybe, she said, locking eyes with him now, maybe your proximity to whiteness has dulled the sharpness of memory. That did it. Donald stiffened, his jaw tensed slightly. The easy smoothness in his demeanor pulled taut, like a rubber band at its breaking point. He didn't look away, but he stopped nodding. His fingers tapped once, then stopped. The moderator, sensing the tremor, quickly interjected with a politician's version of a fire extinguisher. Let's take a step back, both of you. And remember, the focus tonight is on solutions, ways to move forward constructively. But no one was listening to the moderator anymore. Not Donald's, not AOC, and certainly not the audience. The segment had taken on a momentum of its own, like a train that had jumped tracks but refused to slow down. Alexandria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The tension was already doing the shouting for her. When you talk about family values, Congressman, she said, still calm, you talk about structure and pride. But when I talk to mothers in East New York, when I sit with teenagers who've lost siblings to police shootings, their idea of structure isn't nostalgia. It's food on the table. It's keeping the lights on without getting a second eviction notice. It's surviving systems that were never built for them to succeed. Donalds took a slow breath, his tone lower now, edged with frustration. So what, he said. Because I married a white woman, I can't speak on black issues anymore? Is that the game now? AOC didn't flinch. Her reply came without venom but full of weight. I'm not questioning who you love, she said. But I am questioning whether that love has placed you in rooms where pain gets discussed like theory instead of memory, where the ghosts don't speak as loudly, where the sharp corners of this country feel just a little more rounded. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was electric. In that pause, the show stopped being about two people debating. It became a mirror, one that forced the audience to see the distance between identity and experience, between legacy and comfort, between proximity and pain. The moderator tried again, voice lighter. Let's shift toward policy specifics, economic opportunity zones, education investments. But no one had come for talking points. They had come for truth. And for the first time that evening, Byron Donalds didn't offer a counterpoint. He sat still, hands folded in front of him, the room around him suddenly colder. AOC exhaled quietly, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of the moment. She knew the cost of going there, but she also knew the cost of staying silent. And for her, that was never an option. The pause after AOC's last words stretched longer than anyone expected. Byron Donalds sat silent, eyes fixed on a distant point just beyond the camera. His shoulders remained square, his hands clasped neatly on the desk in front of him. But something in his posture had shifted. Not a collapse, just a slight withdrawal, like a man tensing for a blow that had already landed. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, but the tension hung off every syllable like condensation on glass. You keep trying to tell me what I've forgotten, he said. Like I didn't grow up around struggle, like I haven't buried friends, like I didn't come from the same pain you claim to carry. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. But he wrapped his frustration in formality, as if hoping politeness might hide the bruises underneath. Alexandria studied him, not with the sharpness of a prosecutor, but with the intensity of someone searching for something beneath the surface. The edges of his voice gave him away. Not anger, defensiveness, not arrogance, wounded pride. She could have pressed harder. She could have twisted the knife, turned the moment into a soundbite, and owned the headlines before they even printed. But instead, she leaned back slightly, took a breath, and let the moment breathe with her. I don't doubt that you've known pain, she said softly. But there's a difference between remembering pain and repackaging it as policy. There's a difference between surviving history and rewriting it to make it seem kinder than it was. Byron's fingers twitched once on the table. Just a flicker. Enough. Alexandria saw it, the tell, and she knew she'd reached something real. So she kept going. Not for points, not for spectacle, but for the people watching who needed someone to say what they had lived through. My people didn't survive Jim Crow because of it, she said. We survived in spite of it. That's what you're missing. Her voice tightened, not with anger, but with memory. We carried trauma in our teeth just to smile. We held our breath when we walked past patrol cars. We taught our children to lower their eyes, not because they lacked dignity, but because that's how you stayed alive. She wasn't performing. She was remembering aloud. The moderator remained silent now, sensing the gravity. There was no pivot possible from this. And in the control room behind the cameras, the silence was just as thick. Producers stared at their monitors, unmoving, their hands hovering over keyboards and mute buttons they suddenly forgot how to use. One intern muttered under her breath, "Oh my God." Another quietly clipped a 15-second snippet and hit upload. On Twitter, the clip began circulating even before the segment had finished. No Chiron, no edit. Just the line, clear and cold as steel. We carried trauma in our teeth just to smile. Within seconds, it was trending. Back on the stage, Byron Donalds looked at Alexandria again, not like an opponent, but like a man realizing he had walked into a house made of his own echoes and didn't recognize the furniture anymore. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Not out of defeat, but out of something closer to reflection, or maybe restraint. Alexandria didn't move. She let the silence sit. This wasn't about winning. This was about naming what had gone unnamed for too long. And in that moment, no raised voices, no slamming fists, she had pulled the weight of generations into the room, not to accuse, but to witness. And once truth had been spoken like that, without spectacle or venom, the only thing louder than the silence that followed was the sound of millions leaning in to listen. The segment had barely ended when the storm began. Even before the studio lights dimmed and the guests had left their seats, the internet had already cracked wide open, spilling reactions across every digital surface like a wave that couldn't be held back. By the time Alexandria stepped off set, her phone was vibrating with the rhythmic urgency of something far more than breaking news. It was becoming something cultural, something that couldn't be put back into a box once released. Within minutes, progressive platforms lit up like fireworks. AOC didn't just show up, she showed the receipts, read one tweet with over 30,000 likes. On a popular liberal podcast's Instagram page, a clip of her line, "We carried trauma in our teeth just to smile," was overlaid with black and white images of civil rights marches and black mothers holding their children outside burning homes. The caption read, "The truth teller we needed." Another headline from a left-leaning outlet was blunt. AOC dismantles Donalds' Jim Crow nostalgia with one devastating sentence. In activist group chats, her words were being quoted like scripture. Community organizers from Chicago to Oakland were already planning teach-ins using the clip as a launch point. A Brooklyn school teacher emailed her colleagues, "We should build a whole week around this. Let's have students write their own responses to the quote. This is history, unfolding in real time." But while one side of the country lifted her up, the other side sharpened its knives. Conservative media went straight for the jugular. On one primetime network, a panel of commentators tore into the exchange before the credits of Crossfire America had even finished rolling. AOC's attack on Congressman Donalds was disgusting, one pundit said. She basically accused him of not being black enough because he married a white woman. This isn't progressivism. This is racial purity politics. Another segment headlined AOC's ugly double standard, "Why can't black conservatives marry who they love?" Featured old sound bites of Alexandria discussing inclusion, fairness, and open-mindedness, juxtaposed with a freeze frame of her questioning Donalds' proximity to whiteness. It was a hit job, but it was calculated, clean, and surgically edited to spark outrage. Even more centrist outlets weighed in, framing the debate as a dangerous descent into identity policing. Some compared it to Clarence Thomas's historic confirmation hearings, others to the infamous "you ain't black" gaffe from a different political era. The backlash was immediate and intense. By midnight, Alexandria's office was drowning in interview requests, invitations to defend herself, and threats. Some anonymous, others proudly named. Her Instagram DMs were flooded. Half praise, half fury. Her congressional email was inundated with messages ranging from, "Thank you for speaking the truth," to "You're what's wrong with America." In her campaign office, her staff huddled around 3 screens, monitoring the wildfire. Ava, her chief of staff, turned from the main monitor, eyes wide but tired. "They're turning it into something it wasn't," she said. "They're twisting your words to make it about his marriage." Alexandria, seated on the edge of her desk, brows furrowed, didn't reply right away. Another staffer added, "They're not playing fair, and the progressive base is behind you, but this other narrative is spreading fast. You need to wait before you respond." Eva nodded. "They're setting traps. If you reply now, you'll look defensive. Or worse, opportunistic." Alexandria exhaled through her nose, jaw clenched. She didn't like silence, but she knew when silence was necessary. She learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could say was nothing. Yet, her mind played the moment again. The flicker in Donald's eyes, the weight of her words, the truth of them. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out over D.C.'s twinkling skyline, the Capitol dome like a ghost in the night. Let them talk, she thought. The truth had already landed, and when she did speak again, it wouldn't be to defend herself. It would be to finish what had begun. Byron Donalds walked through the front door of his Naples home just after midnight, shoulders slouched in a way unfamiliar to him. The Florida humidity pressed against him like consequence. His tie was loosened, jacket folded over one arm, and in his free hand, his phone buzzed for the 100th time. He didn't look at it. He already knew what it would say. Snippets of headlines, text messages from staffers, half-hearted "you okay?" Notes from colleagues. None of it prepared him for the silence inside his house. Marlene stood at the edge of the kitchen island, arms crossed, barefoot, still in the simple cotton dress she'd worn to dinner. A plate of untouched food sat beside her, long gone cold. He dropped his bag onto the floor and spoke first. "I didn't say your name," he said quietly. Marlene didn't move, but the world heard it anyway. Her voice wasn't sharp, but it was steady, the kind of tone that didn't need to rise to be dangerous. Byron took a step forward, unsure if it would matter. "I didn't even mention our marriage. I talked about values, history, community." She looked at him then, not like a wife looking at her husband, but like a woman looking at a man who'd opened a door for strangers to walk through. And now they were standing in her living room. "You opened it," she said, "and you didn't guard what mattered." He let the words hang, unsure how to defend himself. She turned away, walked toward the sink, and ran the faucet without purpose. The sound filled the room like filler music between commercials. "They're calling me a symbol, Byron," she said over her shoulder. "A tool, an explanation for why you see the world the way you do. I didn't ask to be in that chair with you. I didn't volunteer for this." He knew she was right. He also knew the part that hurt most wasn't that people were talking about her. It was that they weren't wrong to. Her existence in his story gave it a texture he hadn't anticipated, and now she was bearing the weight of choices she never got to make in public. "I'm sorry," he said honestly. Marlene didn't answer. Meanwhile, 1,200 miles north, Alexandria sat on her couch in her D.C. apartment, curled around a pillow with her phone screen illuminating the darkened room. Notifications crawled across her lock screen like ivy. Some familiar names, others she would never know. One DM said, "You are the voice of our buried wounds." Another, more brutal, "Maybe you should stick to bartending, where your opinions don't make national news." Then one simply read, "You just made enemies you can't see." Her inbox was a storm, praise and hate braided so tightly together, it was hard to tell which was which. She didn't reply to any of them. Instead, she played a voicemail. The voice on the other end was raspy but warm, familiar in a way that curled into her bones. Her high school civics teacher, Mr. Del Toro. "Mija," he said, "I watched it twice. You didn't just speak for the Bronx tonight. You spoke for people who didn't know how to say those words out loud. But listen to me. The fire you carry is powerful. Just don't let it burn you too. Truth is good, but it's not always kind to the one who carries it. She closed her eyes, letting the words settle somewhere beneath her sternum. He had always been the one who saw past her fire to the girl who carried it. The girl who once stayed after class to argue about redlining, who broke down during a debate about stop and frisk. He had seen her then. He still saw her now. She opened her eyes. The room was still dark, but her mind wasn't. The truth had a cost. She had paid part of it tonight. So had Byron. So had Marlene. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first sign this was no longer just a headline. It was something human, something messy, something real. 2 days after the broadcast, Byron Donalds found himself seated in the basement of a red brick church on the outskirts of Fort Myers, Florida. The room was humid. The folding chairs creaked under shifting weight, and the air smelled faintly of lemon-scented wood polish and old Bibles. Around him sat a dozen black pastors and community leaders, some old friends, some distant acquaintances who had come now not for prayer, but for clarity. The pastor of the host church, a dignified man in his 70s named Reverend Ellis, opened the meeting with a scripture and a sigh. "Brother Byron," he said gently, "we know your heart. But sometimes the mouth can move faster than the history that shaped it." Some nodded in agreement. Others did not. A younger minister, Reverend Tay Mitchell, leaned forward. "What you said may have been well-meaning, but it was reckless with memory. My grandfather was beaten for standing in the wrong place in line at a bus stop. My aunt was sterilized without her consent in a Georgia hospital in '69. There is no version of Jim Crow that should be praised, not for its values, not for anything." Byron cleared his throat, fighting the urge to interrupt, to explain again what he meant. But he didn't. "Not yet," another voice chimed in, this one softer. "But he wasn't wrong about families," said Reverend Sanders, eyes cautious. "We did have tighter bonds back then. Some of that came from necessity. We had to depend on each other." Mitchell shook his head. "That strength was forged in fire. That's not the same as saying the fire was good." The room went quiet. Byron finally spoke, his tone low, stripped of the polish he'd worn on television. "I wasn't trying to glorify the past. I was trying to remind people that even in the worst times, we held on to each other. But maybe I forgot how close some people still live to that fire." No one responded right away. The silence wasn't angry. It was absorbing. Outside, rain began to patter against the church windows. A storm was coming, but not just outside. It had already settled in their voices. Meanwhile, in the Bronx, Alexandria walked through the bright halls of PS 109, a local public school she had visited often before her time in Congress. Class murals still lined the walls, painted hands in every shade of brown, quotes about justice and courage. The school had invited her months ago to speak to a group of middle schoolers about civic engagement. The timing of her visit now, just days after the broadcast, was purely coincidental. But nothing about her presence felt accidental. In the classroom, 20 students sat upright in their chairs, trying to look casual and cool, but each of them fully alert. A teacher introduced her with a smile that barely concealed pride. AOC greeted them warmly, answering questions about Congress, about protests, about her favorite books, and least favorite vegetables. But as the session ended and the group dispersed, one girl, small, serious, 6th grade at most, lingered near her desk. She approached Alexandria slowly, as if crossing a line she wasn't sure she was allowed to. The girl tugged on Alexandria's sleeve and said in a quiet voice, "You made him look small." The words hung in the air longer than expected. Alexandria turned, knelt to the girl's eye level, and took her hand in both of hers, gently, firmly. "No," she said softly, "I just made the truth look big." The girl looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded, satisfied, and walked away. Alexandria stood and exhaled. In that moment, she understood the impact wasn't about a headline or a viral clip. It was about how truth planted itself, in classrooms, in churches, in conversations whispered between generations. The storms might rage louder now, but they weren't empty noise. They were shaking something loose, and maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. By the end of the third day, the story had grown larger than either Alexandria or Byron. What started as a heated exchange on live television had metastasized into a full-blown national referendum on race, on identity, on history, and perhaps, most dangerously, on intent. The nuance of the moment had been buried beneath 1,000 headlines, each slicing a piece of the narrative and stretching it to fit an agenda. Mainstream media didn't just report what happened. They framed it, dressed it up, and sent it into the world as a spectacle. Some turned Alexandria into a villain, others into a savior. Few told the whole story. Fox News ran their segment under the bold headline, AOC dismantles black conservatism with guilt, not facts. The broadcast cut together clips of her soft-spoken but cutting remarks, interspersed with commentary accusing her of playing racial gatekeeper and undermining the progress of black men who break the liberal mold. One anchor leaned into the camera and asked with a raised brow, "Since when is it racist to marry outside your race?" On the other end of the spectrum, MSNBC opened their primetime coverage with, AOC brings receipts to a historical whitewash. They praised her poise, her command of data, her ability to wrap lived experience in policy precision. One commentator called it a masterclass in reframing false nostalgia, while another argued it was the most powerful moment on live TV since Anita Hill's testimony. Meanwhile, morning talk shows fumbled for balance. One co-host said it was refreshing to see such honest confrontation, while another countered, but shouldn't we be worried about how easily we make personal lives part of public debates? Late-night shows couldn't resist either. Monologues leaned into the absurdity. One comedian joked, AOC handed Byron Donalds a history book, a microphone, and a mirror, and told him to pick one. The studio audience roared, but in Washington, there were no laughs. Inside Alexandria's communications office, her team worked around the clock, parsing reactions, tracking the narrative as it split and spiraled. Screens filled with headlines and transcripts, hashtags and heat maps, notifications buzzing like hornets in a glass jar. Eva was pacing, earbuds in, juggling press calls and damage control, her voice clipped but calm. An aide read out the latest poll spike in approval among younger voters, while another flagged a particularly venomous op-ed titled AOC crosses the line, again. At the center of it all, Alexandria sat quietly at the long conference table, reading and rereading a statement draft on her tablet. Her face betrayed nothing. Not fatigue, not frustration, just a deep stillness, like a tide about to turn. Finally, she tapped the screen, handed it back to Eva, and said, "Send it." The statement went live moments later. My comments during the recent exchange with Congressman Donalds were never intended to cast judgment on his personal life. I questioned his lens, not his love, but I stand firmly against the romanticization of historical oppression. My responsibility is to speak hard truths, not because they're comfortable, but because silence only protects the status quo. The wording was precise, deliberate, and unmistakably hers. Critics called it a non-apology. Supporters called it clarity. But most importantly, it didn't retreat. In the hours that followed, the statement was dissected on cable news panels and Twitter threads. Some said it was too little, too late. Others called it the moment she reclaimed the narrative. A trending tweet summarized it best. She didn't walk it back. She walked it through. Meanwhile, Byron Donalds released no statement. His office remained quiet. Requests for interviews were politely declined. He kept out of the spotlight, at least for now. But the silence on his end only made the noise around her louder. Alexandria had become the focal point of a national conversation, one that refused to fade quietly. And while the headlines twisted and opinions splintered, the truth she spoke continued to echo, stubborn and alive, refusing to be drowned. As the headlines swirled and cable news panels fed the fire, something else began unfolding, not in studios or press rooms, but in spaces far removed from the echo chambers of Washington. In barbershops, living rooms, church pews, and high school classrooms, people weren't just reacting, they were wrestling. The exchange between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Byron Donalds had pierced the membrane between politics and real life, and now it pulsed through the country like a current, impossible to ignore. In an Atlanta barbershop on Auburn Avenue, old heads and young men circled the topic like a sacred ritual. The flat-screen TV above the mirrors replayed the clip on loop. AOC's calm but cutting lines, Donald's response, and that moment of searing silence when neither spoke, but everything was said. A man in his 60s named Troy, who'd been coming to the shop for 20 years, shook his head slowly. He tried to make Jim Crow sound like Sunday dinner, he said, like we all sat around singing hymns and raising perfect families while the dogs were biting us. A younger man, maybe 23, shot back. He wasn't saying it was good, he was saying we had strength. Unity, that's worth something, ain't it? Strength don't justify chains, someone muttered near the back. In a quiet corner of Oakland, California, a small black church gathered after Sunday service. Not for a sermon, but for a conversation. The pastor played the exchange on the big screen in the fellowship hall, the same projector they use for hymn lyrics and Bible verses. After the video, a grandmother named Miss Clarice leaned toward her 12-year-old grandson and spoke with a voice as soft as it was certain. "They're not enemies," she said. "They're echoes." The boy furrowed his brow. "They're both talking to ghosts," she explained. "They just listen to different ones." Elsewhere, in a classroom on the south side of Chicago, a civics teacher had planned a unit on the Constitution. Instead, she opened the class with a simple prompt. "What does truth look like when people remember it differently?" She played the clip. Some students were instantly on AOC's side, nodding with every word. Others saw Donald's point about responsibility, self-reliance, what it meant to build something from nothing. By lunch, the debate had spilled into the cafeteria and onto phones. Teenagers started stitching the clip into TikToks, split-screen duets with captions like "History vs. Nostalgia" and "Two Truths, One Stage." One girl posted herself lip-syncing AOC's words, "We carried trauma in our teeth," just to smile, against a montage of her family photos from the 60s. It went viral in under 2 hours. Another teen, a black boy with 300 followers, posted a shaky selfie video. "I get both of them," he said. "My mom's like AOC. She don't take no sugar with her history. But my pops, he says stuff like Donald's all the time. Like, we had pride back then. I think they're both right. And that's what's messing me up." Everywhere the conversation spread, it took on a new life. Malleable, personal, unresolved. Radio hosts invited local callers to weigh in. Libraries moved displays of civil rights literature to the front of the shelves. A group of college students at Howard started organizing a panel on Black memory and political identity, spurred by a single Reddit thread that had ballooned into a 900-comment debate. The moment between AOC and Donald's had touched a nerve, but more than that, it had exposed a scar, one many had dressed but never treated. And now, with the wound reopened, people were finally looking at it. Some with rage, some with reverence, all with recognition. Because whether you agreed with Alexandria or Byron, the truth was that America hadn't just watched a debate. It had been handed a mirror. And no one walks away from a mirror unchanged. The city lights of Washington blinked like distant thoughts outside the window of Alexandria's apartment. She hadn't turned on the overheads, just the warm glow of a standing lamp in the corner, casting soft gold across the room. Her coat still hung from her shoulders, scarf barely unwrapped. She hadn't even taken off her shoes. The silence felt heavier than exhaustion, but lighter than regret. It was the kind of silence that knew its place, the kind that didn't need to ask questions. She stood for a while in the doorway, scanning the room like a visitor. The bookshelf sat untouched, her orchid leaning slightly toward the glass pane, seeking a sun that rarely reached through DC's gray skyline. The air was still, no voices, no alerts, just the echo of her own breath and the faint whir of the refrigerator humming behind the kitchen wall. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door with a soft clink and finally eased onto the edge of the couch. Her bag, overflowing with paper, buzzed once and then again. She didn't reach for it, not yet. The interview was over. The headlines had peaked. The talking heads had taken their swings. But somehow the real weight was only just settling now, like the sediment at the bottom of a storm-stirred glass. It wasn't fatigue she felt. It was something more alert, more aware. a type of stillness that didn't come from rest, but from knowing the world had tilted slightly and would never be quite the same again. She rubbed her temples, exhaled through her nose, and finally reached into her bag, not for her phone, but for the stack of unopened letters she'd scooped off her desk that morning. They were mostly mail from constituents, typed notes, hand-scrawled lines in pencil, one envelope decorated with glittery stars. She opened the one on top without thinking, just needing to read something that didn't scroll. The handwriting inside was neat, sharp, the letters formed like someone who'd been taught to take their time. The return address was Mississippi. The letter read, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, I'm a 67-year-old Black Army veteran. My father died in Alabama in 1961, shot outside a pool hall because a white man thought he was talking too loud. There was no trial, just a closed casket. I was 3. All my life I've heard people say things like, at least Black families were stronger back then, like our pain was proof of our virtue, like the violence that broke us was somehow good for our character. So when I heard what that man said, and then I heard what you said, I just wanted to tell you thank you for not letting him rewrite it, for standing in the middle of the storm and saying what needed to be said. That's all. Thank you. R. Coleman, Jackson, Mississippi. Alexandria read the letter twice, then once more. Her fingers curled slightly around the paper's edges, as if trying to absorb the ink into her bloodstream. She closed her eyes. Behind them came the familiar flood, the classroom in the Bronx where she'd learned about the Great Migration without hearing about the lynchings that chased families north. Her abuela's trembling hands as she recounted the night ICE raided the wrong apartment. Her own quiet fury when, as a teenager, a boy at debate camp said racism was mostly behind us now. She opened her eyes again. The letter sat in her lap, still and certain. Some truths didn't need to be shouted to be heard. Some fights didn't need to end in applause to matter. She looked out at the window, at the blurred reflections of headlights below, at the moonlight breaking unevenly through the city haze, and whispered aloud, just for herself, I'm not done yet. No one heard it, but the walls, the silence, and the storm that had followed her home, they all understood. The Capitol basement was colder than usual that morning, air-conditioned silence broken only by the occasional click of dress shoes on waxed marble and the low hum of unseen ventilation. Staffers moved quickly, quietly, heads down, coffee cups in hand, most too focused on their deadlines to notice the way two people, two shadows with too much shared space between them, were moving toward each other from opposite ends of the hallway. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had just wrapped a committee meeting. She carried a thin folder tucked under one arm, her free hand slipping into the pocket of her gray blazer. She wasn't thinking about the exchange anymore. Not exactly. It had already been picked clean by pundits, cut into pieces and shared across every platform. But the feeling of it, the emotional gravity, still lived in her chest like a low drum beat, steady, unavoidable. Byron Donalds walked with a slower step, flanked by no one, his usual entourage thinned by media silence and a self-imposed retreat from the noise. The clip of their confrontation had haunted his week, not because he felt ashamed, he didn't, but because he hadn't expected it to hit where it did. He had meant to talk about strength, but what people heard was surrender to the past. Worse, what she had said about proximity and distance had echoed longer in his head than he wanted to admit. They spotted each other at the same time. No one else in the hallway paused, but time seemed to slow for them. He didn't change direction. Neither did she. And when they reached the midpoint, just beneath the low arches and fluorescent lights, in a corridor rarely meant for public view, they stopped. For a beat, nothing was said, just the shared weight of something unfinished hanging in the space between them. Byron spoke first. Did you mean to make it personal? His voice wasn't confrontational. It wasn't angry. It was almost curious. Not the kind of curiosity that demanded an apology, but the kind that was tired of the guesswork. Alexandria looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without a stage or camera between them. He looked tired, though he hid it well. His jaw was set, but his eyes held something softer. Maybe not vulnerability, but something like acknowledgement. She let the silence stretch just a moment longer before answering. It wasn't personal, she said quietly. It was historical. He blinked, brow tightening. But history, she added, is always personal when we're the ones who lived it. The words didn't come from anger. They came from somewhere lower, deeper, from her grandmother's stories, from the Bronx stoops where she learned how to listen before she knew how to speak, from the knowledge that truth, when held too long alone, starts to rot. Byron didn't fire back. For once he listened. He looked past the sharpness of their debate and saw the clarity beneath it. Not agreement, but something closer to understanding, at least of why she'd said what she said, the way she said it. He nodded once, a short, weighted motion. She didn't expect more, didn't need more. They stood like that for a few seconds longer, neither quite ready to move, but both knowing they had to. The hallway behind her called with schedules and press statements. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. The world hadn't stopped spinning just because they had paused. "Take care of yourself," she said finally. "You too," he replied. They stepped past one another without drama, without spectacle. No handlers, no headlines, no hot mics. Just two people walking away from a moment they hadn't planned, but maybe deep down had needed. And though neither of them turned to look back, they carried the silence with them. Not the silence of avoidance, but of recognition. Something had shifted. Not the world, not the politics, but perhaps, just for a moment, the distance between two truths. The exchange in the hallway had been brief, but it lingered in both of them longer than they expected. Later that same afternoon, by chance or quiet design, Alexandria and Byron ended up in the same side room near the old committee chambers, a tucked-away space used more often for waiting than for meetings. There were no reporters, no aides, no handlers, just a coffee machine humming low in the corner and two chairs facing a narrow window that overlooked the courtyard. They didn't sit at first. They stood by the edge of the window, facing the glass but not really seeing through it. The city blurred beyond the pane, movement without detail. Byron was the one who spoke first again. "I wanted to highlight strength," he said, his voice quieter than before, almost like he was speaking into his own reflection. "The kind I saw in my grandparents. They were married 61 years, raised 8 kids, one income, no safety net, just God and grit. I thought, if I could remind people of that, maybe we'd stop blaming and start building." Alexandria didn't interrupt. She just listened, arms folded gently, her eyes fixed on a patch of sunlight crawling across the floor. He exhaled hard. "I didn't know I'd step on bones to do it." There it was. Not regret, exactly, but a kind of recognition. An admission that words once released grow legs of their own. That a soundbite meant to uplift could echo like a wound in someone else's chest. She turned toward him, speaking without sharpness, just the weight of earned clarity. "We all walk on graves sometimes," she said, "even with good intentions. What matters is whether we stop and look down." He turned to face her fully, brow furrowed. "Look down? To see who we're standing on," she said. "To understand that their stories didn't end just because ours began. We don't get to borrow their strength and forget their suffering." For a moment they stood in silence. No tension now, just space, shared space. Byron broke it with a nod. "You know, when I was a kid, I used to think we'd already made it. Civil Rights Act, Dr. King, Black president. I thought the fight was over." "And then?" she asked gently. "Then my cousin got pulled over driving through rural Alabama," he said, jaw tightening. "Cop made him sit on the curb for 45 minutes, hands behind his back. Never said why." Alexandria gave a small, knowing sigh. "The system doesn't need to shout to hurt us anymore. It whispers now. Fines, arrests, underfunded schools. It's quieter, but it's still there. Still sharp." He nodded again, slower this time. "I guess," he murmured, "what I was really trying to say on that stage is, I miss when we had each other's backs." She tilted her head. "We still can, but not by erasing pain, not by rewriting the cost." Their eyes met then, not as opponents, not even as colleagues, but as two people with skin in the game, shaped by different stories, standing on the same soil. There was no apology exchanged, None needed. Just the mutual understanding that their scars didn't cancel each other. They overlapped. They each sat down then, finally, not to draft a joint statement, not to rehearse anything for the cameras, just to be quiet in a world too loud, to acknowledge that history had cut deep and that neither one of them had all the answers. But maybe, just maybe, they'd both stopped long enough to look down. And that in itself was something. The room they'd shared didn't have a name, didn't appear on any televised map of Capitol Hill, and wouldn't be noted in the news cycle that evening. But something had shifted there, quietly, honestly, without applause or accusation. When Alexandria and Byron finally stood to leave, they did so without lingering. No long farewell, no dramatic pause, just a mutual nod. Not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. And yet beneath that nod was something heavier than disagreement, an understanding, perhaps even respect, carved out not by compromise, but by clarity. As Alexandria stepped back into the hallway, her aide was already there, holding her phone like a live wire. Notifications buzzed from every corner of the internet. Commentators screaming across split screens. Edits of the interview circulating again, now layered with ominous music or triumphant anthems depending on the poster's angle. Think pieces were multiplying. CNN just booked you for prime time, her aide said breathlessly. You're trending top 5 again. They want a follow-up quote about today's... Alexandria raised a hand, just slightly, and the aide fell silent. She kept walking for a moment before answering, eyes ahead, not yet ready to explain the weight of the last half hour. Then she said almost absently, "He's not my enemy." Her aide blinked. "Sorry?" She stopped then, turned just slightly toward him. "Erasure is," she said, "erasing truth, erasing pain, erasing what it cost to get here." The aide opened his mouth, unsure of what to say, then closed it. He simply nodded and followed behind, silent. Meanwhile, across town, Byron Donalds slipped through the side door of his DC townhouse just after dusk. The hallway was dim, quiet except for the faint tick of the kitchen clock. Marlene sat curled on the couch, blanket drawn over her legs, a half-read book open but untouched in her lap. The TV was muted, images of a panel show flickering across the screen. His face in Alexandria's frozen mid-debate. He hesitated in the doorway for a moment, unsure if she wanted to see him, unsure if he wanted to speak first. She looked up. He stepped forward, gently lowering himself onto the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I talked with her today," he said. Marlene closed the book softly. "And?" she asked, her voice unreadable. He paused, staring at the floor for a long moment. "She wasn't attacking me," he said finally. "She was guarding ghosts." Marlene studied him. There was no bitterness in his tone, no bruised pride, just something raw, stripped of performance. "She said we walk on graves sometimes," he added, "and we have to choose whether we stop and look down." For a long moment, neither spoke. The TV continued flickering silently. Outside, traffic passed like waves against the shore. Then Marlene reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his. Not to absolve him, not to affirm everything, just to say, "I see you." He didn't need the cameras, or the spin rooms, or the next press release. She had heard him. Across the city in her own apartment, Alexandria sat near her bookshelf again, the veteran's letter still folded neatly beside her orchid. She stared at the blank notepad in her lap, but didn't write. Not yet. Some things didn't need to be put into words right away. Some truths lived better in the rooms without applause, without hashtags, without an audience. Because sometimes real change began there, in the stillness that followed the storm, in the pauses between the headlines, where no one was looking, but everything still mattered. By midweek, something strange began to happen. Not louder outrage, not fiercer division, but something gentler, slower, deeper. Church bulletins across Atlanta and Baltimore quietly added the words community dialogue beneath their Sunday listings. Pastors stood in front of their congregations, not with sermons polished in isolation, but with chairs arranged in circles and microphones passed between pews. One grandmother stood and told her story of raising 3 sons during busing integration. A college freshman, just home for break, listened and wept openly for a pain he had never been taught to name. In Chicago, a public school teacher tossed her lesson plan out the window, not literally but emotionally. That Monday, instead of jumping into algebra, she asked her class what they thought about what they'd seen between Donald's and AOC. For the first time all semester, every hand went up. Students spoke of race, of pride, of confusion, of how it felt to see two black leaders argue not about party, but about the past. Podcasts erupted with raw honesty. Hosts admitted what their textbooks hadn't taught them. Listeners sent in voice notes about grandfathers who never spoke of Mississippi, about mothers who scrubbed floors by day and studied by night. On one show, a caller simply said, "I didn't know I needed to cry until I heard her say we smile with trauma in our teeth." Civil rights groups began issuing statements, not of condemnation or victory, but of reflection. One headline read, "This wasn't a debate, it was a mirror." And somehow, through all the noise, people weren't just listening. They were talking, not to win, not to wound, but to begin the conversations they never knew they'd needed. The clip had already made its way across newsrooms and boardrooms, but in Tulsa, it found a different home. Inside a public middle school classroom with cracked tile floors and faded posters of Maya Angelou and Nelson Mandela. Ms. Reed, a social studies teacher with salt and pepper hair and a voice that could cut through chaos like a whistle, paused the video just after Alexandria's line. "We carried trauma in our teeth just to smile." She let the silence sit, not to create drama, but to make space. These weren't just kids. These were future voters, future organizers, future rememberers. A girl in the second row raised her hand slowly. "I didn't know politics could feel like truth," she said. "Like, someone finally said the part people always skip." Another girl, younger, barely 12, leaned forward on her desk. "I want to be like her," she said softly. "Say what hurts, but still stay soft." No one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. Even the boys in the back who usually scribbled in notebooks or tossed paper quietly looked up. For once, the moment had their full attention. Ms. Reed nodded. "That's not weakness," she told them. "That's strength with an open palm." By the end of the week, AOC's Bronx office was overflowing with envelopes, letters in slanted cursive, drawings of her with a superhero cape, poems written in pencil on notebook paper. Some were from Tulsa, others from Detroit, from El Paso, from Little Rock. One postcard simply read, "You made space for us." Alexandria read everyone. Not because she needed validation, but because they reminded her what the fire was for. It wasn't to burn the old down, it was to light the path forward. The headlines began to fade, but the undercurrent didn't. In Jacksonville, Byron Donalds sat at a round table hosted by the Florida Alliance for Interracial Dialogue, a space he had quietly avoided in past years, often citing scheduling conflicts or lack of alignment. But this time he arrived early, sleeves rolled, tie tucked into his shirt pocket, eyes scanning the room with a readiness that didn't need applause. He listened more than he spoke. He nodded through testimonies from single mothers, veterans, and faith leaders. And when a young man asked him directly if he regretted his words in Tampa, Donalds didn't sidestep. "I regret what they erased," he said. "I regret what I didn't ask before I spoke." Across the country, in a sunlit library in the Bronx, AOC stood beside historians and educators as they launched the Coalition for Historical Literacy in Schools. There were no TV crews, just local reporters, teachers, and students holding clipboards. She spoke not of the broadcast or the firestorm that followed, but of the quiet duty to truth. "History doesn't need defenders," she said. "It needs revealers." They didn't name each other, didn't quote or tag or reference the viral clash, but their paths kept brushing through initiatives, legislation, hearings, like tectonic plates no longer colliding but shifting, dragging the terrain around them in new directions. And in that shift, something undeniable began to settle. They had become, unintentionally, the symbols of a discomfort this country could no longer outrun. Not enemies, not allies, but mirrors. Two people carrying different scars and walking however uneasily through the same fire. And because of that, the nation watched a little closer. spoke a little louder, and for once listened past the noise. The Capitol woke to a rare silence, as if the building itself was holding its breath. No scheduled press conference, no confrontation on camera. But something hung in the air, something the reporters could feel without quite being able to name. It wasn't resolution, it was reverberation. Then just after 9 a.m., Alexandria's statement went live. Typed in plain black font on a white background, it carried no party logo, no slogan, no soundbite-ready headline. Just a quiet assertion: I stand by challenging romanticized oppression. I stand for truth over tenderness, and I respect the complexity of us all. The words landed like a drumbeat across social platforms. No hashtags, no filters, just clarity. Commentators scrambled to interpret it. Some praised her strength, others questioned the tone. But the real audience, the students, teachers, mothers, veterans, the kids who had written letters in crayon, read it not as defiance, but as anchoring. A reminder that telling the truth didn't mean picking a fight. It meant honoring the memory of those who never got to speak. 2 hours later, Byron Donalds released his own. Shorter, no flourish, but not hollow. Dialogue must be honest, even when it hurts, especially then. No excuses, no walking back, no applause line. His supporters read it as maturity, his critics as too little too late. But within the communities that had watched this story unfold, not from the safety of debate rooms, but from living rooms, classrooms, and front porches, it felt like something rare. Two public figures choosing not just to clash, but to grow. Cable news tried to pair the statements, read them side by side, but they didn't match because they weren't supposed to. They weren't coordinated. They were parallel, separate expressions from different experiences, walking in the same storm, facing different winds. Later that day, neither AOC nor Donalds took interviews. No follow-ups, no retractions. Just words and silence. But this time, the silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like space. Space for others to speak, reflect, and maybe finally listen. And somewhere in a classroom or a church basement or a father's worn chair in the corner of a living room, someone whispered aloud what they hadn't dared before. Because truth, when said without fear, doesn't disappear. It invites courage, even from those who were never supposed to agree. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind Washington forgets to remember. Gray still, with just enough chill in the air to make coats necessary, but conversation cozy. The Library of Congress stood quiet, its marble halls hushed like a cathedral of memory. No reporters lingered, no staffers trailed behind. It was, for once, a room without spectacle. That's when they saw each other. Alexandria had come to clear her mind, tucked away in the archives, leafing through oral histories of civil rights activists. Byron had wandered in from another wing, curious about a Frederick Douglass exhibit he never made time to see before. They met by chance at the junction between past and present. There was a pause, not of hesitation, but of recognition. She raised an eyebrow with a half smile. They want us to fight forever. He exhaled, chuckling low. Then let's ruin their script. They didn't sit, didn't need to. Instead, they leaned against opposite ends of a reading alcove and talked. Not like politicians, but like two people tired of being reduced to headlines. They spoke about legacy and exhaustion, about what it meant to be Black in politics, but with entirely different maps. About pain passed down like heirlooms. About the weight of always having to choose words that don't ignite. It wasn't peace. There was too much scar tissue for that. But in the rhythm of their voices, low, honest, unguarded, something else emerged. Not agreement, not concession, understanding. A moment outside the noise, brief but indelible. As they left in separate directions, neither turned back. But for the first time, they didn't walk away from something. They walked forward from it. The library doors eased shut behind her with a faint metallic click, sealing the quiet behind marble and history. AOC stepped out into the light of late afternoon. The warmth hit her skin, not just from the sun, but from the street's hum of life, movement, and momentum. It was different out here, louder, messier, more real. Across the plaza, a group of children, maybe 4th or 5th grade, were holding signs made of cardboard and glitter, shouting chants with more heart than rhythm. Their teachers hovered nearby, proud and cautious. The signs weren't angry, they were curious. One read, "What's in our textbooks is not the whole truth." Another simply said, "We want all the pages." Alexandria stopped walking. She didn't wave, didn't call attention to herself. Just stood there for a long moment, watching them. Watching the way one boy helped a smaller girl lift her sign back up after it slipped. Watching how they leaned into each other like trees that had learned to stand tall by growing close. And in that pause, unrushed, unspoken, something settled inside her. "We don't grow by shouting louder," the words echoed quietly within her. "We grow by standing still long enough to hear what hurts." This time she did smile, not for the cameras, not for the polls. A smile that held both softness and steel. Because she knew now that truth didn't always win with applause. Sometimes it endured in silence. Sometimes it marched in glitter and cardboard. And sometimes it stood on the sidewalk, watching, remembering, ready for what came next. She turned and walked on, not away from the noise, but through it, carrying forward what mattered. Not just the fire, but the fuel.